research and the mind. Just to name a few, for example, the language comprehension in different modalities, like in auditory and visual, and semantic access, or bilingualism, and language emotion interaction. And methodology-wise, Professor Thierry used a range of topics to, well, I guess taking advantage of each to look into those, for example, like behavior or experimental approaches, looking at reaction time, error patterns, or imaging, brain imaging, including from IPP, as well as electroencephalogram, or ERP. I'm sure if you take a single method or single topic, he's able to give a talk that lasts for a whole day, but I think today he prepared something special. While reading along his abstract, it reminded me of one saying that I like a lot. It goes like, sometimes we spend too much time coping with problems that are along our path that we forget why we are on the path from the beginning. I think it's similar with scientific research. So if you think about it, research comes about because we want to understand the world, how we think, who we are, and sometimes we really are too much focused on the question in front of us, and we lose the big picture. So I'm really excited about today's talk because he's going to take us to a journey from the experimental outcomes to some philosophical thinking. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thierry.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I'm sorry, I apologize for having to leave in the middle of the day. I would have loved to stay for the whole thing and particularly for the discussion, but I have another talk to give in Bangor tonight, so I'll be on the train soon after lunchtime. Yes, it's wonderful to be here because I really care about methods. I think that trying to understand the mind is a big game. And I mean, Kita's presentation was great in the way it showed you the developmental track from gathering ideas, observing things, trying to understand what's going on, and then progressively narrowing down to an experimental track. I won't give you anything as brilliant as this in terms of gearing towards experimental evidence. I will launch on you a massive experimental attack right away, if you don't mind, because what I'd like to do a fairly short time, so what I'd like to do is give you some flashcards of experiments that I think have worked quite well to tell us something about the mind and language, studying language and mind. And then towards the end, I'd like to spend 5 minutes on the part that's most close to my heart right now, which is how we can perhaps derive some philosophical understanding or questioning deriving from this research. Okay, so, and by the way, this is definitely the longest title I've ever put on slides, so I'm very happy that it managed to fit there. Okay, so first I'm going to provoke you, because I kind of like provoking people. Can I ask how many of you are second language speakers of English? Can you put your hand up? Wow, good. We have a little bit of a yeah. So if you are not, don't worry. It's not you're not ill or anything. All you need to do is to imagine if you actually speak another language, that this talk is given in that second language, and therefore you find yourself in the same position. Or if you don't know the language, you can just use imagination to imagine that you would speak another language, which is a second degree, but it works as well. And the idea is that if you were a second language speaker of English or another language, what if I told you that what I tell you right now, every single word I produce right now, you are translating into your native language as I speak, automatically and unconsciously. And it's pretty counterintuitive. I don't know if you agree, but you would say, like, no way. I can understand what you're saying. You know, I don't need to translate this into my native language. What a waste of time and energy. How much, you know, how under-efficient would that be? The thing is that I provoke you, so I'm telling you, you know, just imagine for a second that you're doing this. Another thing I'd like to put as a provocation is imagine if you were presented with words like these that are words in English, and you are asked to look at the slide but not read, you know, just look around or find some shapes or whatever. You would still translate every single word on that slide in English into your native language, despite the fact that you're not even reading them. That would be very counterintuitive, right? You would think, no way, that's not happening. What if I told you that if these words were negative, for example, if these words would say be like murder or war or crime, you would actually not fancy translating them and you would stop translating them into your native language. The process would wear off and you would not access your native language. That would be also quite counterintuitive, wouldn't it? And even perhaps more scary or more complex. What if I told you that when you have two words in a particular language describe different objects, and whereas in another language only one, these objects are perceived differently at a physical level, and you actually perceive them physically differently when you have these two words compared to someone who's done one word. And that would mean that the world would look different depending on the looking glass through which you're looking at it, be it being the language. That again, basically is the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And everybody goes like, what? No, wait a minute. We have a non-verbal conception of the world, and it's quite common, it's quite universal. How would it be modified by languages? That's ridiculous. Well, for all of these things, I'm going to present now some evidence. And I'm not saying that this evidence is radical and definitive. It needs to be studied in different ways, different levels of proficiency, different language pairs, different contexts. But the evidence I'm going to show you is very strong that all these things are actually true. And we can discuss it. Before I go on to show you the data, I need to introduce to you ERPs very quickly. I have to do it very quickly. Apologies. But evaluating potentials, how many of you are familiar with evaluating potentials? ERPs. Okay, that's pretty good, so I can just probably brush, big brush strokes. Evaluating potentials give you an image of brain activity that is average over a number of events. And the idea behind them is very clever idea that Ansberger had in the 1920s, which is very simple really, is that activity of the brain, right now all your brains are producing massive quantities of activity. And that activity is, I wouldn't say it's random, but it's very complex. It's very elaborate, it mixes origins from, motor control, posture control, memorization, processing of language stream, and so on and so forth. All these things combine into the activity that we can measure on the surface of your scalp, which is the summed up activity from your brain. Now, if you want to extract from this activity that's specific to a particular process, you're going to have to clean up that activity. And the simplest way to do it is using averaging. Effectively, if I present a stimulus regularly to your brain, be it a sound or an image or whatever, and we average the activity produced by the brain in response or shortly after the stimulus, what's going to happen is the activity that is random, that is not connected to the stimulus, is going to wear off in the process and disappear. Whereas the activity that's specifically related to the stimulus is going to start coming out of the noise. Does that make sense? I don't have much time to explain it more, but the idea is that if you present, for example, sentences like this, he takes his coffee with sugar and milk, and you measure the activity produced by the brain on presentation of the last word. Imagine you do this for a number of times and in a number of participants, and you average all this together. You're going to get a waveform. This is, for example, an activity measured at the top of the head here, with an electrode set right at the top. And if you look at this activity, it shows you how much activity is produced specifically to that group of words presented at the end of the sentences. Now, you have a complex here, which is a visually triggered or visual process ongoing at the back of the head, and it's maximum there, but it's also measurable at the top. And then you have a kind of a recovery period. But if you happen to show a word at the end of the sentence that is unexpected, for example, dog, I think you would agree with me that it's kind of infrequent to put dog in your coffee in the morning. Even though for me it's actually more expected than milk at this point. I've seen this for about 12 years or 14 years. Here you can see that this negativity, there's a negative shift in the wave, and that negativity, called the N400, because it's negative and it peaks around 400 milliseconds after the onset of the stimulus, is actually proportional to the amount of expectation for that word. So it's an index of semantic processing. And in fact, it's an index of much more. It's an index of meaningful integration of any kind of information, but it's particularly efficient with language. And it's very sensitive to repetition. If you repeat information, just collapses. It goes away. And it's proportional if you make the end of the sentence even more unexpected, you're going to get a bigger N400. Okay? If you put universe at the end of the sentence, which is completely aberrant, because you could conceptualize a sugar in the shape of a dog, or you could actually, why not, just dip your dog in the coffee because you love your dog so much. But you can certainly not put the universe in your cup of coffee, right? You could also use a non-word, arguably anything that's meaningless, and you would increase the N400. Okay, so why am I showing you and introducing the N400? Because we're going to use it as the index to answer the questions that I put up for the provocation part. And so, first of all, I'm going to show you this study, which is kind of one of the foundation stones. So, 2007, Kita, me too. It's one of the foundation stones of my work on access to the native language completely unconsciously. And that's work done with Yang Wu, who's now at the University of Sheffield. It was basically his undergrad project initially. we looked in Chinese English bilinguals at access to Chinese information in a context where only English information was presented to them. The entire experiment was run in English. There was no mention of Chinese at any point. And the idea was to see if, despite that, they would still access, co-activate their native language. So we did this using this very simple trick, really. We showed pairs of words, and participants are asked whether the words are related in meaning or not. So here you can see that these two pairs are related, look at matter, but these pairs are not related. And the question for the participants was to say whether the words were related or not when they saw the second word. Now, from an N400 point of view, you expect that the N400 is going to be reduced for this as compared to that, because the relationship is going to activate in the semantic network related words. But whether you don't know, well, we took great caution not to tell them. And believe me, it was an interesting game, because the Chinese community in Bangor is 150 students, basically. So you tell one, and the next day everybody knows. So you have to be very careful with this. We never revealed the trick, I mean, until we started talking about it, which was only a few years later. And so the game was that if you translate these words in Chinese, there is a character repeated in the translation. And it's completely concealed, it's hidden, participants don't know that. And we've done this experiment both in the auditory modality, spoken words, and in the visual modality, reading words. Note that the overlap was complete. That is, the characters look the same and sound the same in this experiment. And this experiment, you can see the repetition of the character is a cross, it's an orthogonal factor. That is, you have pairs that are related in meaning or not related in meaning that share a character, but you have also pairs related in meaning and not related in meaning that don't have a character shared. And this is the second factor on the experiment. So, these are the results, and I'm just going to quickly take you through them. This is the N400 manipulation, the semantic manipulation. And as you can see, when pairs are related versus unrelated, you get an N400 effect. It picks at 400, it's by the book, and it's found for any group of participants, that is, English natives reading the stimuli in English, or listening to the stimuli in English, Chinese English bilinguals doing the experiment in English, or Chinese natives who are a control group doing the experiment in Chinese. These guys can see the entire manipulation. They were never presented with English material. So they're a control group of Chinese natives who recently arrived in the UK. Sorry if I speak very fast, I hope it's okay. So the idea is this working, basically. The semantic manipulation is working. But what for the character repetition factor? As you can see, in English, we don't see much of an effect, thank God, because they don't know Chinese. It would be very worrying, but it's a good control to see that there is no effect of character repetition. In the bilinguals, you can see that we have an effect. And in the natives, we have an effect too. And this effect is the same magnitude, which is the incredible thing. There is no interaction. So despite the fact that these guys saw or heard the characters repeated, they have an effect of priming that is the same magnitude as the bilinguals. And these guys never saw the Chinese. The only explanation for this is that they have translated online the words that they saw or heard in Chinese. I can see Martin going, no. It's okay, it's a long story. We'll get to that. So I would argue, against Martin, but perhaps a few others, that this is a sign that they have access to the Chinese translations of these words. Now, since then, we've done 7 replications of this experiment, and we've manipulated a range of variables. Not only do we have cross-modal effects, but we also have these effects in different settings and situations. For example, we have found that this is phonological information that they're accessing in their memory, not visual information. That is, they don't care what the look of the characters are. What matters is the sound. So even if you're presenting it visually, what matters is the phonological overlap between characters. And we've established that clearly. We've also replicated this experiment in production, which is even more worrying or strange, because in production you would think that the speaker is in control of what they're saying, and they don't need to access their native language for speaking a second. Even that's been shown by asking participants to name the color and the name of an object in sequence. For example, a red apple, for instance. And we did this with German English bilinguals. They are German natives, and the entire experiment is in English. What they don't know is that in some cases we ask them to name, so for example, green goat. Green goat has a phonological repetition, so we're going to see some priming. But if you say blue flower, there's no repetition. However, in German, blue flower is Blaublume. which contains the phonetical repetition again, but in the non-spoken language. And guess what? We get priming for that. And that's because they have also produced the German in their head, and without knowing it. So we have evidence that this works both in comprehension and in production. Okay, second question, second provocative question, which is even more troubling, like arguably, is do you have to pay attention to these words? Do you have actually to read them or pay attention to them to translate them? And this is the experiment that Yanjing came up with one day. He came to my office and he showed me this, and I burst into laughter and I told him this is never going to work. You know, we've done fun things before, but that is never going to work. So here's this idea. We present a fixation cross and then we present 3 words. They are to be ignored because the target is either 3 circles, 4 circles, 3 squares, or 4 squares. So in other words, you have a shape detection task, which is the most elementary and simple thing you can do. And what you have to do here is to press a button when you see them. And, okay, I think everybody could do it, even if it was a foreign language. Then, in some trials, you have filler trials, we call them filler trials, in fact they're critical trials, where you have 4 words. When you have 4 words, you have nothing to do. You're just waiting for the next because there is no target. Okay, that's the idea. What the participants don't know is that one of these words, fully rotated and controlled, and as you know, the usual recipes, one of the words translated into Chinese contains 1 character which in Chinese means circles or squares. Now, clearly this is never going to work. It's completely mad. It means that when they are looking at areas of words that they are not supposed to read or do anything with, they are just got to wait for the next trial where they're going to get the target, they would look more at a word that has partially within its structure the word for the target, which has never been shown. Okay. And guess what? These are the results. 100 milliseconds more. You see that the control condition here, which is English monolinguals, the looking time is completely the same for critical and non-critical items. But for critical items, in the Chinese English bilinguals, the time they spend on these targets is 50% more. That is a huge effect. And they are just attracted by these words, and believe me, they don't have a clue why, because they don't know where they're looking, actually. So it's pretty impressive. But in passing, this is eye tracking, and you know, I don't really care what the method is. What it matters is that it answers the question. That's the main thing. So what we're trying to know is whether you have to be fully attentive and have an intention to understand the concept, you know, the content of language to get these effects. I would argue that you don't. If you see a word, your brain just fetches the equivalent in your memory without asking you permission. And then it gets a little bit more tricky when we look at effects of emotion. And so why do we look at emotion-language interactions? And the reason for that is quite simple, is that the developmental time course of a language, especially in sequential bilinguals or bilinguals that learn a second language later in life, the relation to emotion has to be asymmetrical. So for example, it's a bit anecdotal, but it works for me. I hope it will work for you. I could never conceive of saying to my daughter, I love you, because it seems disincarnated. It means it feels a bit weak. She doesn't have any problem to saying I love you to me because she learned English from birth. And so for her, the emotional connections between the language and the emotion is kind of, you know, built progressively throughout life. She can also say it in French. But when I say that to her in French, that has all the meaning for me. I mean, it's basically, you know, connects to the emotional system. And so we wanted to test whether that would have an impact and whether we could differentiate between emotional effects in the first and second language in bilinguals. And we basically, you know, sorry if it sounds a bit boring, but we just did exactly the same study again, but this time we manipulated the emotional valence of the first word. So we presented these pairs here, finance, metal, arguably unrelated and neutral. I agree that finance is not so neutral for students, but you know, it's what we got. Stimulus control is difficult in this environment. Holiday was positive and murder was negative. And in all these cases, we have a phonological repetition. This is why I only show the pinyin here, because the characters don't really matter. What matters is the sound, as I told you before. And we wanted to see if the priming effect would be the same for these different conditions. Now on the left here you have the English with their magnificent non-priming effect, because of course they don't know Chinese. Here you have the Chinese monolinguals or controls tested in Chinese, and you can see priming for all 3 conditions. Yes? whether the prime is positive, neutral, or negative, it's C prime. And then comes the boom, the surprise, the unexpected finding. When the prime is negative, thank you very much. I don't want to know what it is in my native language. I shut down lexical access in Chinese. Can I just tell you that not only the process of accessing that information is unconscious, but this is a very high-level process. You are evaluating the semantic, the emotional valence of a word, and that has a consequence, decides whether you're going to access a native representation or not. The fact that there can be a switch like this is fascinating, but the more worrying thing is that this happens completely outside consciousness. How is it possible that your brain can decide whether you're going to translate a word or not in your native language, depending on its emotional valence? That is pretty staggering, I think. And the effect is absolutely, I mean, it can't be more clear. It's on-off. It's not even quantitatively ambiguous. You have the neutral and the positive that prime completely and to the same level, and the negative doesn't have a shred of priming. And I think that's pretty interesting. It shows you how the brain can repress some information that you don't really want to face. This is how we, I don't know how Journal of Neuroscience allowed us to do that, but we managed to publish this under how reading in your second language protects your heart, which is kind of fun. They were very kind of letting us. I don't know why the reviewers didn't challenge that, saying it's a bit cheap as a title. Well, anyway, we got it. So, lexical access is filtered, or non-selective language access can be filtered by emotional valence. And effectively, we have evidence that negative words can shut down lexical access in L1. Okay, how am I doing for time? 10 minutes? Okay, not bad. So now I want to show you, so we've replicated these effects of non-selective language access in many domains. We've done it in compression and production, I've already shown you that. We've done it in different pairs of languages, with Romance languages versus Chinese English, which shows that because they were so different, of course, there's no overlap, no link possible, no cross-activation just due to linguistic structure or phonology or orthography. But we also found it in the syntactic domain, which is even more surprising. And I mean, we have two studies in particular that have shown that when Welsh English bilinguals process English, they apply rules of the other language to their first language or equally fluent language. So we have in the room we have Awel sitting at the back here next to Kerry, who's done this study, which I'm not showing you the details, but I think it's a fascinating study showing that when you have a structure, a syntactic rule that exists only in Welsh, applied to English, which of course is going to look alien, you can imagine, because it doesn't exist in English, Welsh English bilinguals are accepting this application of the rule, even though it's not, it's completely anomalous. The entire experiment is in English, and the rule that we used was soft mutation in Welsh. So, for example, the word cat, which means cat in Welsh, if you present it after the determiner, it becomes gaff. It mutates into a different word. Basically, the first phoneme changes, k to g. And that does not apply only to the nouns, but also to the adjective. For example, vow, which means big, becomes mau, mutated. So you would say a gaff mau, which is a big cat. I hope I did get that right. A gaff mau is a big cat. But the primary form, the fundamental forms is calf and vow. Now, these rules don't exist. They're completely alien to English. You don't mutate English words. But what we did in an experiment with Awel and Manon Jones in Bangor is we actually mutated English. So we presented sentences, saying they went to the concert instead of concert. I hope you heard the difference. Concert rather than concert. And of course, these are non-words. But despite the fact they're non-words, if they are mutated appropriately, that is, as they should be in a Welsh context, the Welsh English bilinguals are accepting these words more than control conditions where they should not be mutated. It's completely fascinating, given that all this is garbage in English, in theory, right? Of course, it's not in Welsh. And so I think that's a fascinating demonstration that this non-lexical access to the other language is not just in production or comprehension and not just at lexical level. It goes all the way up to syntax. It's a very elaborate, intricate interaction between languages, basically showing how interconnected and globally interactive our brain is. Now, I wanted to show you also that language can effectively flex perception. the type of words you use to describe objects changes the way you conceptualize, but also even perceive things in the environment. And this is a couple of studies done with Panos Athanasopoulos, who's now in Reading, I think. Yeah, it's in Reading. He's just moved to Reading, and he's a specialist of color perception and linguistic diversity and linguistic creativity in relation to color. And we did this study that used the visual mismatch negativity. It's a different event, so I have to introduce it very quickly. If you show a repeated stimulus on the screen for a while, and then you ask participants to simply pay attention to the stream, they don't actually have to process them actively. This effect will happen automatically. So here you can see the response from posterior electrodes to a repeated stimulus. And if you change the stimulus, the color, the shape, whatever you want to change, you're going to get an increase in the N1. This is a very early effect, within 200 milliseconds, and it's really, at the doorstep of any kind of linguistic information kicking in and being used. So it's very early and probably perceptual. We can discuss that later if you want. So what we did was we presented these fantastically fascinating streams of stimuli for 15 minutes. And we literally cooked our participants in the lab, showing them a dot repeated on screen like this. And from time to time, of course, the color of the dot could change, but from time to time they had a shape change. And what their target was the square. We never mentioned color. We didn't need to, because the experiment was based on shapes. So the square could be either color that's very regular or the rare one. And the reason why we did this is because we wanted to see how the brain would react to that difference between a standard color and a deviant color in two types of individuals. Greeks, who have two names for these colors, and I hope we can get confirmation from them. So this is halasio, and this is blé, you would agree.
That's right.
And this is not light blé, and this is not dark halasio. They are different colors. And in English, they are blue, arguably. Now you're going to tell me they are light blue and dark blue. Absolutely. But if I ask you to name these colors in isolation, in a stream of colors intermixed with orange, black, red, and green, you're going to call them blue. Whereas the Greeks will call them halasio and blé, because they're different colors. I think you get the gist of it. The idea is that they are basic color terms in Greek, whereas in English, the basic color term is blue. And as for green, the interesting thing is that English and Greeks are similar here, because this is green, and of course it's prasino in Greek. There's no, forgive the pronunciation.
No, it's perfect.
The difference in color is of the same magnitude, if you want to. The categorization is the same. And what we wanted to know is if the visual cortex or the visual system of these bilinguals would differ from the British, because in theory the British should see these differences as similar, because they've only got one name for the two colors. So these are the results in English. You can see here the predicted VMMN, visual mismatch negativity, and you can see that it is exactly the same magnitude for the blue deviancy and the green deviancy effect. So this is a close-up, and you can see that the magnitude is the same. Now this is the Greek speakers, and they're doing exactly the same task in all the same condition. And this is the green effect, and can you feel the suspense? So can you imagine, before we show that on the screen of the experiment, after 6 months of hard work, twice the size for the blue effect. Now, these stimuli are identical. Everything is controlled physically with a colorimeter in the lighting condition of the lab. They are extremely well aligned, and you can see from the British reaction that they are very similar. And these guys show twice the size of an effect for the blue. And our interpretation of this is that they see the difference between light and dark blue as more salient than the difference between the greens. And the best explanation for it is terminology. Now, so we could conclude that a different language means different perception. And in fact, we decided to replicate this in the domain of objects, of physical objects. And this is an experiment done with Bastien Penet, my PhD student who's now moved to the US to work with Gary Lupian. And here, basically, we've done exactly the same study again. Sorry, boring replication again. But this time, we're changing slightly the experiment with shapes. So we're going for cup, mug, or cup, ball. And the target is the ball. Now, in English, there is a change here in terminology. Now, I give you the fact that it's not complete. You can call this a cup. but don't you dare call this a mug. I think if you do that in Tea Party, you'll be fine at that, in the British world. This is definitely not a mug. So there is an asymmetry from the terminology point of view. But in Spanish, and as it happens in French, these two terms are actually exactly the same. It's tasse in French and tafla in Spanish. And you can't name them any other way because there's no other available word. And so the question is, would you have a difference in the way these are perceived or categorized at very early stages of perception based on terminology? And the answer is yes. And this is the result for the British. They show a difference at the VMMN range between tasse and between cup and mug, but the Spanish don't show it. And the interaction is significant. Meaning that the difference in a language has driven a difference at the perceptual level. And all of this, of course, is arguably unconscious. No, I'm done with my evidence, and I hope I have 2 minutes to do the philosophical crazy spell. Are you ready for this? Okay, so this is, I'm just going to jump like really massively now, and I'm very conscious about this. But I've been trying to look at all the evidence I've collected over the last 14 years, and I'm trying to make sense of it. I'm a bit crazy, I do jump on everything that I find interesting, but I was trying to find a common stream. What is the common thread? And what I realized is actually the common thread is that in every single experiment I've run today, participants have no idea what's going on in their brain. That is a process at the highest level of cognition. We are accessing semantic information. We have interaction between languages, between syntax. I have other experiments showing executive control modulation by language context. All of this completely outside participants' awareness. Even, not only do they have no clues, but there is absolutely no sign in the behavioral data for 95% of our studies. There is no evidence at the behavioral level that they know or that the factors manipulated have an effect. And so what am I likely to conclude about this? Well, I'd like to connect that to the field of decision making. Do we have any freedom? Do we actually decide anything? Try to generalize this. If you think about it, you can consider that we are a completely deterministic system that there's randomness in the world out there, and that the interactive phenomena in the brain explain our behavior entirely, 100% of it. There is no space for freedom, zero. The zero freedom paradigm. And the idea is that every moment where a decision is made by our biological system, 100 billion cells, have you ever talked to them? What happens is a few milliseconds later, after a decision has been made, you are being informed. And you are perpetually in that illusion that you have made that decision at a conscious level, even though it was made for you by a system that you know nothing about, which is basically you, but the different you, not the you that is conscious, aware, interested in life and having friends, the you that actually is built bottom up by this extraordinary network of cells. And so I summarize this in a quite radical manner by saying that we're all emperors. Just like emperors, we have the illusion of control. We think we control the country, that we have strategies for the future, that we can decide the destiny. We have zero control. We don't know what's going on in the little houses everywhere. We have no idea what the outcome of a war is going to be. And we have basically no direct control over anything that's happening in the country. We're just thinking we have that control, but we don't. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for the very informative talk and a little bit thinking. At the end, you can still have some flavor of it or keep it home. And now we have some time for questions. So,
Andrea.
I want to come back to your claim that the last experiments that you showed about colour is actually on the level of perception.
Yeah.
We happened to have Euro Sturup in our department last week.
Yes.
Who talks about very early semantic effects. So why are you thinking that this is perceptual and not semantic?
It is perceptual, but it could also be semantic. My conception, my view here is that the brain is not I have a very, very strong tooth against modularity, so I'm just sorry I have disclosed that. I don't believe that there's a system in the brain that deals with language and that's separate from the rest of the system. And so for me, the brain is a massive network of cells There's clearly some specialization and some firewalling of some process, very elementary processes, but it's a very highly interactive system. And so for me, these processes emerge by virtue of interactions between language systems, perceptual systems. For example, there's a famous experiment by Victor Lam's group, and I don't remember the other authors, but they show monkeys things about to happen in an environment. And they cue the environment. They say it's going to happen there, but the monkey doesn't know. You can see surges of activity in the primary visual cortex, the earliest primary visual cortex you can find in the monkey, even though there is nothing, in the tens of milliseconds before something is shown. What does that mean? It means that the cognitive system, the higher level cognitive system of the monkey, is applying a pressure, is basically downstreaming some information, right down to the primary visual cortex, in expectation of something to happen. This is the level of interactivity we're talking about. So the fact that language has an effect on perception is so incredibly obvious. It's not even that we need to talk about it. Like, I don't know how people can resist it. What I'm saying is, the problem is that I don't think it's a phenomenon that exists at the perceptual level per se, independently. It's not like language has imprinted perception, and perception operates on its own with the language structure. No, it's a fully interactive process. And we've shown with Panos, in a study of cognition, where we split participants by long stay and short stay bilinguals, we can show that this effect is going away. As they stay longer in the UK, their use of English becoming more regular, the effect starts going away. Why? Because there's this full interaction between language system and perceptual system, and it's moving. And we have also some primary evidence that the plasticity is much greater, that it can happen in a degree of few milliseconds actually. So for me, it's a very interactive process. I have no problem in saying that the language system is actually implicated in some way in these effects. But it also is perceptual. There's no question that it's the perceptual system that is causing this to happen. We even have effects in the P1. That's really early for any high-level linguistics going on. But yeah, so I think it's basically rethinking the brain as a massively interactive, system. Martin, I'm surprised you have a question.
I'm not just thinking about bilingualism. Is this stuff that I was thinking about?
Yes.
So I think that a lot of these effects are sort of some fantastic naming going on. So a lot of these linguistic relativity things are, when you have two colours that are very similar, and in a particular language you're better at judging the different, if you've got words that correspond to those.
Okay.
Then what you're doing is you're accessing the colour codes, and then you're comparing those codes.
Yeah.
And I think in these cases you may, the window at which this is occurring is that same sort of 150 millisecond kind of
200,
the sort of window where it could be electrically related.
Well, so we have about 4 publications on language production, timing.
Yeah.
We have, I think we have some of the most precise estimates of when lexical access starts. It
Right.
starts, not resolves. So the diving into the lexicon, I would put a 190, 200 millisecond tag on it. That's the best evidence we have from studies we've done with Albert Costa and Christoph Streikers. So it's the same time. It's basically that window, it's around the same time. I think it's unlikely that you have basically covered naming of the color feedbacking on the actual color perception. I think what's happening is that these two types of information are accessed in parallel. You have probably some covered naming going on, which is completely unconscious, by the way. I think you have to agree that this level of automaticity involved here is absolutely colossal. Note that, for 50 minutes they are being put in the lab looking at these dots, right? And when they come out, we have done a very careful debriefing of the participants. We asked them, what did you see on the screen? You can imagine the kind of, they were looking at us like, are you kidding me? Say, well, just describe it. So say, well, I saw circles and squares. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So what about colors? Oh yeah, colors. So the squares, they could say the square within the block could be 2 colors. And what about the circles? Oh no, the circles were all the same color. Are you sure? Yes, they were all the same color. In one block, you had 1 color for the circles, and you had 2 colors for the squares. And you have to understand why. When you have been sitting for the first 10 seconds, you notice, oh, let's change the color, but I don't care because I'm looking for a square. After about 2 minutes, this being your target, you basically don't pay attention to the color changes. You're completely unaware. You don't care. To the point where they would have sworn that it didn't happen. You know, we had 5 participants who were adamant that the circles within a block were the same color. And you know, when you show them on the screen, they can't believe they're the same experiment, even though they've seen it for 50 minutes. And why? Because this is the level of, you know, so I'm not claiming that there is no covered naming going on, but I think that it's at a level of automaticity that basically it doesn't, at this point, doesn't matter. Because it means that in everyday life, you are, the language system is fully interacting with perception anyway, because you're doing this in complete oblivion. Yeah?
I'm not actually disputing this story, except that I think that your use of interaction is rather, I mean, I just don't think it's the right kind of story. I think the right story is a predictive coding, it's a forward modelling story, rather than an interactive story. I mean, the idea that there's actually feedback going on seems to me much less likely than what you're doing is learning the contingencies between particular stimuli appearing and the likely way that should be produced. You know, the term associated with it. You know.
So are you saying that every time I see an object, I'm accessing in parallel every single descriptors that relates to that object?
Yes.
Wow. No?
Well, not everything. You're accessing certain parts of it. I mean, if you think in terms of like predictive coding, then that's exactly the kind of thing you are claiming to be doing. You're sort of starting to, and so all these findings of sensitivity of syntax and visual cortex and all those kind of things that occur within 100 milliseconds. I mean, those are sort of, you know, those could be thought of in predictive terms. So what you're doing is you're getting some kind of evidence that something's going to happen later, and then you get it.
I mean, I see where the distinction is trying to make, but I'm still, I mean, I don't see why a feedback system, which is completely online, almost like an oscillatory system, right?
Yeah.
As information feeds through the system, you have constantly bottom-up activity going through the system, nourishing the processor, but you have information top-down, constantly filtering and checking what's going on. And we see this, by the way, we know about this phenomena at different, of course, in different levels, like for example in speech perception. You constantly have top-down filtering and monitoring, and even elimination of some irrelevant information, or with the Magog effect, fusion of different sources of information to completely change the percept. So for me, this is, I don't see why it's incompatible with kind of a feedback regulation that's operating, you know, constantly through the processing.
I think it can be. I think
it's but I'm not claiming that this experiment can distinguish between these two models. I agree with you. It's a big job.
You?
I was kind of interested in your nasty word switch-off effect.
Nasty word.
Yeah,
actually, they were not nasty at all. You know, unhappiness.
Okay, but there's this switch-off process translation to L1.
Yeah.
What's the nature of that process? So is it really happening on a, but is it in your data happening on a word-by-word basis, or is it a build-up across the course of an experiment in which you're encountering unpleasant words?
So what this is actually sharp here. It's unlikely it would have come up like this if there was a blurring. For example, if sometimes they would access the translation, but not always. And so I think the clarity of this effect probably shows that, you know, negative words is just not translated. However, we have to be very careful here because we had a major disagreement with Yanjing on the interpretation of this data, and to this day we have not resolved it. We need to do further experiments. In fact, I don't believe that you shut down access for negative words. He believes that, but I don't. And so I was trying to be gracious and present his view, but my view is what's happening is actually more interesting. When you see the negative word, you have to see, if you look at the design, the valence is on the prime. It's very important. The valence is on the prime. The target is neutral. Why? Because we didn't want to conflate the emotional appreciation of the word with the priming effect. We wanted to keep them separate. So we put the emotional valence on the prime, and we could study the priming effect on words that were all neutral. Now, why is that interesting? Because what Yanjing thinks is that when you read the negative word, you don't access the translation, and therefore you lose the priming effect. But I don't believe that operates like this. What I believe is happening is, you see the word murder, you access it in your native language, as you would for any word, and that you don't like. That's when you're shutting down lexical access, and when the target comes in, that's the one you're not translating. So I think what's happening is that in terms of time course, it's a knock-on effect of the negative valence. But you, of course, you're accessing for me, it's parallel, it can't be filtered at this speed. You can't have evaluation of the emotional valence of this that is going to condition lexical access online. It's very unlikely. And we haven't done the
difference between an access block and a block of access, which is the two different things.
That's right. What you can do also is reverse the experiment, but then there are some methodological complications that come in. But what we've done is simply looked at the prime. And when you look at the prime, the remarkable thing is that the emotional valence effect for positive and negative was the same. And it's largely bigger than for neutrals. These words are processed in the same way and to the same extent. And there's a boosting effect of emotion, but it's the same for positive and negative. What happens, I think, is that this is the shutdown. But we don't know yet. But what's interesting in this process is that an emotional mechanism is gating information access in your brain, unconsciously. Now, you can understand why people can sit in a court of law and say, I never killed him. Because they have actually psychologically forgotten. Their brain has refused to access that information anymore. They can be they could look so incredibly innocent or naive because their brain has basically shut down access to that. Or the likes of post-traumatic stress disorder, where some information is just no longer available. And you didn't make that decision, right? Somebody, somewhere, a network of cells who want to protect you, arguably, or it's probably the best solution for you, has decided to renounce access to that information. And I find that fascinating that we have these mechanisms we have absolutely no control of, completely built in.
But the nature of that mechanism is still...
Oh, well, it's just scratched the surface. Right? I don't want to claim anything else. Yeah, thanks. Cheers.
If you have other questions.